The Bible that we read is full of incredible stories. We read stories about people that we think we'll never measure up to. There's Moses. When Moses led Israel out of Egypt, that was an amazing story. And we read stories about Moses. Man, what a hero, what a hero. We look up to a guy like Moses. David, of course. David kind of had a downturn in his life, did some incredible things. The most famous king, King David. But he killed a giant with a rock. We've heard that story before. We'll probably never be a David. Daniel was another guy that took a stand for his faith and got thrown into a den of lions and spent the night with lions, came out unscathed, unharmed the next morning when the king came back to check on him. In the New Testament, there was a guy named Stephen who was the first martyr, stood up for the faith. And these are heroes of the faith. And sometimes when we read the Bible, we wonder, is there anybody like me? I mean, is there anybody like me? Is there anybody like me in the Bible? For the next 3 weeks, we're going to talk about a guy named Jonah. Jonah was so much like you, and he was so much like me. Jonah writes the book, self-titled Jonah. He writes this story about himself, and understand that if you wrote a story about yourself, let's just be honest, you might embellish the truth a little bit. For sure, when kings had stories written about them, their memoirs, somebody else wrote the story, and the truth was always embellished a little bit. And here Jonah gives a detailed account of just a sliver and a slice of his life, but he's so brutally honest about himself. And maybe what we know Jonah most for, if you've grown up in the church, you know the story about Jonah. If you've never grown up in the church, you've heard the story about Jonah and the whale, or Jonah and the great fish. Jonah was a runner. The premise of the story that we're going to read today is Jonah was a runner. He ran. And I think it's true that in your life and in my life, all of us at some point have been a runner. There's something that we want to run from. There's an uncomfortable situation. There's a reality. There's a truth in our life that we don't want to confront, we don't want to deal with, and so we're going to run from it. What we don't realize is in the process of running from something, we're also running to something. We don't always know what we're running to, but we're running from something. We want to get away from this, and people run all the time. They run from a bad marriage. People want to run from a bad relationship. They want to run from financial difficulties. They want to run from a health diagnosis. They want to run from parental authority. They want to run from their past. They want to run from something that in the present is very uncomfortable. And when we run, it looks different for all of us. Sometimes people run right from one relationship into another relationship. And coincidentally, the next relationship looks and feels so much like the one that they just left. And sometimes people, they'll run to a job. They're not literally leaving home, but they've left home. They've checked out emotionally. They're so immersed in their job. We might call them a workaholic. People might look at them and admire their work ethics, but really all they're doing is running from something that is uncomfortable in their life. Sometimes people run to a hobby. They run to a hobby. And they immerse themselves in the hobby, and it seems so consuming to them, and their whole life evolves around that. Some people run to their children. It's all about the children because the marriage is so bad, the children become the solace. They become that which we run to. And then when the children leave the house, now all we're left with is him or her, and now we're faced with running to something else again. People run from a diagnosis. It's a lot of different things we can call it, but ultimately we could say it's just denial. It's denial. There's something that God is dealing with in our life, and we need to confront it and face it and have courage to deal with it, but we don't want to deal with it. And so we deny that it exists. We justify our actions. We justify what we want to do. We justify who we are. And when it boils right down to it, we're just running from something, a lot like the guy that we're going to read about in just a moment. And let me just tell you something. You know what? You can run from God all that you want to, but you can never outrun God. And God will continue to pursue you until you are forced to face the very thing you're running from. And God does that not because he's cruel, but because he loves you. And I'm here to tell you today that if you're running from something or someone, you need to stop. You need to face the circumstances. You need to face the issue. And in the midst of facing that circumstance, you're going to discover the power and the person and the plans of a gracious, amazing, and loving God. But you don't believe that. Because at some point in your life, when you were honest with somebody, you were honest with your parents, you're honest with a spouse. And that honesty, the response that you got with that honesty was punishment. And so we tend to keep a secret. We try to keep secrets from God. We try to run from God. And again, you can run from God, but you can never outrun God. If you brought a Bible today, I'd like you to find the book of Jonah. Scroll there, page there, turn there, however it is that you get there. If you're watching at home, watching online, we welcome you. We're so glad that you're part of Life Church today and what we're doing here. If you turn in your Bible, you find the book of Matthew and you go back a few pages, you'll be in the book of Jonah. Don't be embarrassed if you have to go to the front of your Bible and look at the index or the table of contents, find Jonah. We're going to be in Jonah, starting with chapter 1. Let's read the story. Let's just see how it all plays out. Jonah chapter 1. Verse number 1, Jonah 1:1. The Lord gave this message to Jonah. Now, Jonah is writing this about himself. Jonah was the son of Amittai. Here's the message. He says, I want you to get up and I want you to go to the great city of Nineveh. I want you to announce my judgment against it because I've seen how wicked its people are. I realize as we read that, Nineveh really means nothing to us, but it meant a lot to Jonah. Nineveh, the city of Nineveh, the inhabitants, the culture of Nineveh, when you read about Nineveh, it was really no different than the culture that we live in today. In fact, it was far more violent. If people were captured and brought to Nineveh, it was not uncommon for them to be skinned alive. It was not uncommon for them to be burned alive, to have a foot cut off, or a hand cut off, or a nose cut off, or a tongue cut out. If they conquered a king, they would make the king come back and pull the king of Nineveh, his chariot through the city to humiliate that king. That's the kind of reputation that Nineveh had. I mean, you could name cities in the United States, and cities in the U.S. all have a reputation. Las Vegas got a reputation. Detroit has a reputation. Chicago has a reputation of having the best football team in the NFL. So I mean, I'm just seeing if you're still with me this morning, that's all. And so into that culture and that climate, God says, I want you to go to Nineveh. You know the city today, it's still in the news. It was in the news this last week. It's in the news all the time. The city is called Mosul. It's in the country of Iraq, northern Iraq. And Jonah gets the command of God. He's supposed to go to Nineveh. We don't know how long he ponders this commission from God. But in essence, Jonah says, no way, Jose. Look at verse number 3. But Jonah, he got up and he went in the opposite direction of Nineveh. To get away from the Lord, he went down to the port of Joppa where he found a ship leaving for Tarshish. He bought a ticket and he went on board, he hoping to escape the Lord by sailing to Tarshish. Now, I find that part really kind of humorous there. I mean, you and I both know enough about God, like, can you run anywhere from God? You know that you can't run from God because God is everywhere, and yet you and I have all tried to run away from God, to run away from the circumstances, to deny reality. Now, I realize that Joppa and Nineveh and Tarshish really mean nothing to you as far as geography goes. So I put it up here on a map so you can kind of get a little bit of a picture where it's at. You can see where he's starting out in Joppa. You can see Nineveh to the right up there. He gets on a ship and he goes as far away as he can possibly go. Like, put me on the French Riviera, get me to Spain, get me anywhere. I just don't want to deal with God, you know? And so I would imagine maybe Jonah, he's walking through the harbor there in Joppa, and he sees all of these ships in the harbor. Where are you guys going? We're just going up the coast a little ways. We're going to Greece. We're going over to Crete. We're kind of going down towards Morocco. We're just all over the place. We're headed to Tarshish. Tarshish. Well, he knew where that was. That was as far away from anything as you could possibly get. It was like going to Montana. I mean, it was just the way it was. So he decides, I'm going to get as far away from God as I can possibly go. And he heads a sailing west. Buys his ticket. Gets on board. I would imagine he couldn't hardly wait for them to weigh anchor and get this journey a-going. The ship begins to sail west, carrying the winds. Whew. Yeah, this feels good out here in the open seas. And somewhere out there in the midst of that deep blue Mediterranean Sea, Jonah's going to have a meeting with God after all. Look what it says in verse number 4. But the Lord hurled a powerful wind over the sea, causing a violent storm that threatened to break the ship apart. Big seagoing vessels have a mark on the side. You maybe never even noticed it because you've seen it so much. It's called a plimsoll mark. The bottom of the ship is painted one color, the top is another. Or it might have a line drawn around there. The plimsoll mark is an indication that cargo is going on. And the closer the plimsoll mark comes to the surface of the water, you can tell how much cargo is on that ship. The closer the line is to the surface of the water, you know it would take less effort to sink that boat because it's just closer to the surface of the sea. God intervenes by sending this amazing storm. I would imagine the water by now had gone far above the plimsoll mark, if there was one on this ship. We don't know if the ship was huge, small. We don't know, 50 sailors, 200 sailors. It's not important to the story. What's important to the story is Jonah and his interaction with God. And so the waves start to break over the bow of the boat. I would imagine that for any sailor that was above board, he was drenched to the skin. That salty sea was blowing in his face. We don't know if it was day, if it was night. And the waves begin to break over the bow of the boat, over the sides of the boat. It's listing from one side to the other in the turbulent sea. The story goes on in verse number 5, fearing for their lives, the desperate sailors, they shouted to their gods. These are not Christian guys. We don't know who these guys were. We know that they're on a merchant ship going from Joppa to Tarshish, and they started calling out to their gods for help. And they threw the cargo overboard to lighten the ship. Well, boys, we're not going to make any money on this trip. They started tossing stuff over the side and calling out to their God, save us. You can imagine the salt spray and the wind. You can hear it. You can feel it. Now, in the middle of this, the rest of verse 5 says, but all this time, Jonah, sound asleep down in the hold. Isn't it true for you and for me at times when we're in places of denial in our life, everybody else can see the shipwreck coming, but we can't? Or at least we refuse to. Are you sure you want to date him? Are you sure you can afford that? Are you sure you want to move there? Are you sure you should do that? We're asleep spiritually to the voice of God because we're in denial, because we're running from God. Well, the captain of the ship, he gets involved now. I would imagine Jonah's down below somewhere there. He's in the hold. There's a dim lamp lit, hanging from the ceiling. He breaks open the door to the hold, and the captain, it says in verse number 6, went down after him. And he shakes Jonah to wake him up, and he says, how can you sleep at a time like this? Haven't you wanted to do that to somebody in your life? Just slap them and say, what are you thinking? And that's what the captain does. Is, how can you sleep at a time like this? He shouted, get up and pray to your God. I mean, we prayed to our gods. Now you pray to your God. Maybe he'll pay attention, and he'll spare our lives. You got to do something. We've exhausted every resource. We don't have hardly any cargo left. We've got some food left. We prayed to our gods. There's really nothing to do. You pray to your God instead of sleeping. Verse number 7, then the crew, they come downstairs. I don't know, again, if there was 50, 100, 200, they come downstairs and they're gathered around Jonah and the captain. This is the way I see it. You can hear the creaking of the planks as the ship rocks in that turbulent seawater. The bilge is rolling back and forth in the bottom of that boat. The lamp hangs up above, and the crew gathers around now as kind of judge and jury for Jonah, and they started to cast lots to see which of them had offended the gods and caused this terrible storm. Casting lots. I don't know if they threw cards against the wall, and whoever gets the ace, they're guilty. I don't know if they put rocks in a bag. I don't know if they drew straws. But they're trying to figure out who caused the storm. These superstitious sailors. Who caused the storm? There's got to be a reason for all of this. And so they cast lots. And when they cast lots, I don't know, we probably got some guy named Joe walking around with a bunch of straws in his hands. And everybody's pulling the straw. And they pull long straws out. And then they get down to just a couple left. And Jonah pulls out his straw. just a little tiny one. Awkward. All the eyes got wide. And then the question started from the sailors. Verse number 8. Who has this awful storm? Why has it come down on us? They demanded. Another guy in the back of the crowd says, who in the world are you? Somebody else, well, what line of work are you in? And finally another guy, what's your nationality? Like, I don't know what you did, but boy, you ticked somebody off really bad. Verse 9, Jonah answers, I'm a Hebrew, and I worship the Lord, the God of heaven, who made the sea and the land. He'd already told them that he was running from them. The story goes on, verse number 10. The sailors were terrified when they heard this, for he had already told them that he was running away from the Lord. And then they say, oh, why did you do this? They groaned. Why? Like, we're going to die out here, you jerk. Verse number 11. And since the storm was getting worse all the time, they asked him, well, all right, since you're the cause of the problems, what are we supposed to do? You just kind of, Jonah had to have some kind of in tune thing with God, because look how he responds to that question, verse number 12. Throw me into the sea, Jonah said, and it will become calm again. I know that this terrible storm is all my fault. Isn't it true? Isn't it true that when you're running from reality, isn't it true that when you're in denial, isn't it true that when you're unsurrendered to God, isn't it true when you're purposely disobedient to Him, that anything that disrupts your level of comfort in your life, your conscience is stricken, and you're thinking, I know this is because of what I did. Isn't it true that you feel guilty? You just think, God's after me to punish me. This is my fault. Your conscience gets the best of you. So Jonah says, look, it's my fault. Throw me in the water. Verse number 15, then the sailors, they picked up Jonah and they threw him in. Can you imagine how this goes? All right, guys, 1, 2. And somebody goes, wait. Do we let go on 3 or do we say 3 and go on 4? Like, 3, and they throw him over the side of the boat, and because the storm is raging so violently, you barely hear him hit the water. Kaplooch. Down he goes. They threw him into the raging sea, and the storm stopped at once. In my Bible says, all the sailors looked at each other and said, whoa. Well, it says that in yours too, because look at verse 16. The sailors were awestruck by the Lord's great power, and they offered him a sacrifice, and they vowed to serve him. Isn't it true that in our lives, not only our disobedience, but our obedience has a profound effect on the people closest to us? Look, Mom, Dad, if you're disobedient to God, and you're living your life in rebellion, your kids are watching it, and they know it. They can spot a fake a mile away. And then all of a sudden, when Mom and Dad or somebody in life starts to turn and get sincere with God and surrenders to God, those closest to it go, there is something different about that man or that woman. It has an effect. Verse 17 says, now the Lord, I love this, now the Lord had arranged. The Lord arranged for a great fish to swallow Jonah. You know what's amazing to me? Is even in the midst of our disobedience, God is still pursuing us in His grace. He hasn't given up on Jonah. He didn't abandon. He could have just had him thrown over the side of the ship. The sea calmed down, and he just went bloop, bloop, bloop all the way to the bottom. That's the end of the story. We're done. But God made an arrangement because He was pursuing Jonah, not to pay him back, but to win him back, just like He's doing with you this morning. And so Jonah's out there and he gets swallowed by this great fish, and Jonah was inside the fish for 3 days and 3 nights. Now I know if you're maybe watching online or something, or you're here today just checking out church, you came because somebody promised you a free lunch or whatever, you go, yeah, right, you think really this Jonah dude was in a fish for 3 days? Really? You believe that? Well, look. People have invented submarines and men, women, they live in these submarines below the surface of the waters for like months at a time. We've even put a guy on the moon. And I'm thinking, if humans can do this, don't you think the God that created Earth and the galaxy and the universe and all the stuff in the universe, all those galaxies, don't you think he could maybe kind of work this whole fish thing out? I think he could. I'm just thinking he could. He's in the fish 3 days and 3 nights. God was pursuing him, and he's pursuing you. Look what it says in Proverbs chapter 3, verse number 11. My child, I love it. Whoever wrote that, they were from the South. Child, don't you reject the Lord's discipline, and don't you be upset when he corrects you. You know why? Because the Lord corrects those that he loves, just as a father corrects a child in whom he delights. God hasn't given up on you. God hasn't given up on you. He pursues us not to punish us, but to love us back to a place of safety and security. And he's pursuing Jonah, and he goes after him with a fish. I'm kind of curious. What would it take for you for God to get your attention? Oh, we see how bad it got for Jonah. What about you? Is it when she moves out of the house? Is it when the debt collectors start banging on your door and calling you and sending mail? Is it when you get the diagnosis from the doctor and either you change or you die? Is it when you're sitting in jail? Is it when he breaks up with you? When does it happen that we finally say, okay, God, I see where you're at? What if? Here's a what if. What if before things got to that place, we just surrendered and said, okay, God, I'll do it your way. I'll be obedient. I'll face my fears. Story goes on incredibly in chapter 2 of that same book, Jonah chapter 2, verse number 1. Then Jonah prayed to the Lord his God from inside the fish. You know what's amazing to me about that statement? How long was he in the belly of the fish? How long? 3 days and 3 nights. I'm thinking if I was in the belly of a fish, I'm thinking within the first hour, I'm saying a prayer, right? It's obvious to me Jonah was German. He was as stubborn as they come, all right? 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, and then he prays and cries out to God. I'm telling you, God will get you to the belly of a fish. He'll do whatever it takes to get your attention and pursue you because he loves you. And look, after he prays, look how God responds in verse number 10. Then the Lord ordered the fish to spit Jonah onto the beach. God is so patient with us, isn't he? So patient. I wonder if you know anybody that feels the pressure today. I wonder if you know anybody that feels the pressure from running. I wonder if you know anybody that feels the pressure of running from the problems in their life. We'd look at their life and go, well, they're just in denial. And they're running from the problems, and they're running to alcohol or drugs or to a habit or to a relationship or to a hobby or to their children, or they're just running to something else, but they're not dealing with the thing that they need to deal with the most. In fact, you know what we do? All of us do this. All of us, when we get into a place where we don't want to deal with something and we pray about something, we usually don't pray about what we need to pray about. We pray about other stuff to try to direct, like, God, no, don't talk to me about that. Look at this need over here. Look at this over here. Don't talk to me about this. You know about that and I know about that, but we'll just push it off to the side. How bad does it have to get until you surrender? How bad does your health have to get? How bad does your marriage have to get? How bad does your conscience have to get? How bad does your relationship have to get? How bad does it have to get before your will is surrendered to God's will? How bad does it all have to get? Here's what I want you to understand, that God will bring you to these places to confront you with what you're running from until you surrender to him. And when you surrender to him, you find the power of God, you find the peace of God, you find the presence of God, you find the person of God. And you find freedom. And you find this liberty from the thing that you're afraid of the most. And you start to discover that, you know what? I can do this. God is amazing. He is so good, so gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in loving kindness. Just surrender and ask for God's help. But you know what? You know what I know about you and me? Here's what I know. You and I are every bit as stubborn as the 3-year-old we try to help with their jacket. I do it myself, you know. Want me to help? No. You've all been there. You all tried that, didn't you? You know? Our stubborn self-will. Let me ask you, we're gonna close, we're gonna pray, we're gonna spend some time to pray today. We're gonna open up these steps at the front. We call these an altar, but it's a steps, and it's a great place to pray. What if we surrendered our marriage? Yeah, the bad marriage. You know, the one where you're praying about him. Oh God, help him understand me. Help him know you. Help him get it. The marriage where you're always trying to change the person you're married to through your prayers. What if you said, God, I'm sorry about that, praying like for their change. God, change me. I surrender my self-will and my stubbornness to you. What if instead of trying to leverage our children and manipulate our children and hover over our children to make sure that they're safe and protected, we said, God, I receive my children from you. I give them back to you again. They're not mine, they're yours, and I trust them to you. What if let me get a little bit personal here. What about money? What if we said, all right, God, you know what? I've heard Pastor talk so many times about being a percentage giver, starting out with 1%, 2%, getting up to at least 10%. God, I'll write you a check. After my next paycheck comes, I'll prove to you that I trust you. And I'll write out a check for 10% of my income. Or I'll use my phone to give it, whatever it takes. How do you think it might feel if you started to trust God with money instead of trusting yourself? I mean, the list could go on and on and on. What about your future? You're so scared about the future. And you're trying to manipulate and leverage and just make sure that everything happens just right so your future turns out just right. I mean, the American dream is that I grow up healthy, I have kids with straight teeth and good-looking grandchildren, and I have an RV to travel in when I'm... What if you just said, God, I just give all that to you? I'll just give up my self-will to your will. Because God is pursuing you to show you that he loves you. You can run from God all you want, but God, because he loves you, will force you to face what you're running from the most.